And in an historic first, they also committed to helping those species recover, so that the life we share our planet with can not only survive, but thrive. Making these goals a reality will take all of us working together. Reverse the Red is supporting governments, conservation experts, and communities around the world as they join forces to activate tried and tested tools and tie global efforts to local expertise. All in a coordinated effort to assess, plan, and act for wildlife. Together, we can save species from extinction. Together, we can secure our planet's future. Together, we can reverse the red.
Hello, and welcome to this Reverse the Red webinar on assessment. And I'm seeing all of your wonderful greetings pop up in the chat. Thank you everyone for joining us. Let's get started. My name is Jennifer Swandby. I work for Rewild, and as part of that role, I'm on the Reverse the Red steering committee, and I'm really looking forward to today's webinar to talk about how assessments can help us reverse the red. This is a 1-hour webinar in a panel format, and it's one of the first, if not the first, one that Reverse the Red is organizing after our World Species Congress that took place in May. And I think a lot of you here today know about the webinar because of the Congress, so welcome. It's good to see you again. Thank you for coming. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed onto YouTube, and so you will also be able to access this recording of the webinar after we're finished here today. As I mentioned, my name is Jennifer Swandby from Rewild and Reverse the Red. This is a panel format webinar, and so let me quickly introduce to you your panelists, and then we'll get started into the topics that we're going to discuss today. So I have here Barney Long, Senior Director of Conservation Strategies at Rewild, Caroline Lees, Director of Science for Multi-Species Planning at the IUCN SSC Conservation Planning Specialist Group, Phil McGowan, Professor of Conservation Science and Policy and the Chair, at Newcastle University, and Chair of the IUCN SSC Global Biodiversity Framework Task Force. And then we also have Mike Clifford, Strategy Director at Reverse the Red. So hello to all my panelists, and thank you for joining us today. As you saw in the video, hopefully, that we were playing as you joined, we're going to be looking today at the actions recommended for individuals, for nonprofits, for governments at kind of each of those levels to take in order to achieve the world's biodiversity targets. And these are ones that are specifically mentioned in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So I want to start with a little bit of background for everyone. I'll show some slides in a moment, but we're essentially going to break up this webinar into 3 stages, or actually 4 if we include the final one. We'll look at this the action that we recommend taking in relation to assessments, and look at that first component. So what it is to assess the conservation status of all species And then second, we'll look at identifying the needs, the species that need the targeted recovery action. As was mentioned in the introductory video, we're really looking at saving species from extinction, but also recovering them. We will then hear about the work of Reverse the Red in facilitating and supporting this work, and then we'll save some time for Q&A at the end. Please put your questions and your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom if you're joining by Zoom and you're able to do that. And so please put those there. We'll save that time at the end there to answer your questions. Okay, let me share my screen. I have some slides to, again, capture some of the more wordy bits of our webinar today, with just some slides about not only Reverse the Red, but also the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So in way of introduction, this webinar is run by Reverse the Red. When we're a coalition accelerating efforts to recover species and supporting countries in achieving Target 4. And I'm going to tell you what Target 4 is in a moment. The way Reverse the Red it looks to achieve this is to accelerate conservation action through collaboration and alignment, supporting the use of science-based tools, strategies, innovation, and best practices, and through amplifying conservation through storytelling and celebrating success stories. You may be here today because you know about us through the World Species Congress, and you heard about the webinar through the Congress and through mailings afterwards. If not, welcome, and please look up the World Species Congress. We've got a whole day, 24 hours of programming about conservation up on on the website for you to view after the fact. It took place in May, and it was a wonderful community moment for over 10,000 people representing 203 countries and territories who attended this 24-hour virtual and free Congress. Well, 201 speakers representing 68 countries presented across 168 sessions, and this included as well representatives from 16 different governments. In addition to the online virtual event, we also had 96 satellite events taking place in person or in a hybrid format across the world, also highlighting efforts to recover species in those places. But now I want to bring us to the kind of next stage or next phase of Reverse the Red's work. The Congress is a major part of what we do, and we hope to repeat it again. So watch that space, which really covers the amplifying conservation success component of our work. And the other part of networking, connecting, and really supporting national level targets and their achievement is what we're going to be talking about today. And so to give folks a little bit of background, we're going to be talking about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework today. This was an agreement signed by the world's governments through the Convention on Biological Diversity. Supporting this framework is the IUCN Global Species Action Plan. There's a link there on the screen for you, and we'll put it as well in the chat for you, and it should also be in the video description once this is recorded. For you to browse what those actions are, browse the document, but also the resources that have been collected for you to use and to inform the process of really integrating what it means to conserve species through every one of the Global Biodiversity Framework targets. And then ultimately, the way this framework and its targets and goals will be developed are achieved is through the national biodiversity strategies and action plans of each country. And so this is the kind of ecosystem that we're going to be talking about today, and what Reverse the Red really wants to support. We want to support this process and folks working at each level, the local, national, and global levels, to really make this possible and to recover species worldwide. Staying at kind of this high level for at least that context, I want to zone in at least on goal A of the framework. And this is the one we're going to be talking about today. And it states that the integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems are maintained, enhanced, or restored, substantially increasing the area of natural ecosystems by 2050. That human-induced extinction of known threatened species is halted, and by 2050, the extinction rate and risk of all species are reduced tenfold, and the abundance of native wild species is increased to healthy and resilient levels. The genetic diversity within populations of wild and domesticated species is also maintained, safeguarding their adaptive potentials. And please go to the CBD website to look up the other goals, or you can watch the next webinars in this series to learn about other goals or other elements of this work. But really, Reverse the Red is focused on goal A, target 4 in this webinar series. We'll be looking at each of the actions relating to these, but that information is available out there for you to learn about the full framework. We will be looking at target 4. It's one of 23 targets that the framework is achieving by 2030, and they're all interconnected. And that is also the purpose of the Global Species Action Plan, is to highlight how species conservation fits throughout all of these targets. But today we're really going to focus on target 4. And in fact, Reverse the Red is focused on as well, achieving target 4. And the wording of target 4 is as follows: to ensure urgent management actions to halt human-induced extinction of known threatened species, and for the recovery and conservation of species, in particular threatened species, to significantly reduce extinction risk, as well as to maintain and restore the genetic diversity within and between populations of native, wild, and domesticated species to maintain their adaptive potential, including through in situ and ex situ conservation and sustainable management practices, and effectively manage human-wildlife interactions to minimize human-wildlife conflict for coexistence. The goal A also has a monitoring framework, and the headline indicators for target 4 under that framework are the Red List Index and the proportion of populations within species with an effective population size of more than 500. And so we'll go into a little more detail on this today and throughout the webinar series. Now let's look at the Global Species Action Plan, and you'll see that the target 4 has 7 different recommended actions. And each of the webinars in this series will look at these 7 actions. Today, we're though going to focus on the first one, which is to assess the conservation status of all species and identify those needing targeted recovery actions. We're going to look at the 4 sub-actions in 2 parts, as I mentioned at the start. We'll start with what it is to assess species and how we can do that. And then we're going to look at identifying the species that require targeted action and then monitoring progress on recovering them. Okay, I will stop sharing my screen. And now I want to go to our panel to talk about all of this content that we just introduced. And I'd like to start with Phil McGowan. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to us about why Target 4 was developed amongst all of the other targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework, and what it is really trying to get to, what if there's a specific intent for this particular target. Phil?
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer. As I start to do that, I think the first thing there's a couple of important context pieces. One is that the goals are all describing the outcomes. And those are things that we want to see. And their deadline, the ambition to achieve those outcomes is 2050. But the targets all describe actions. So those are actions that we need to undertake in order to at least begin to take the right steps to achieve those outcomes. And they've got a deadline of 2030. So the intention is that as we roll up to 2030, we'll have a look at those actions, or the parties to the convention, 196 parties to the convention will have a look at those actions and see, are they the right things? Do they need to have changes? Do things need to be added or dropped? So they're very different, the goals and the targets. That was the intention. So when the zero draft, which is the first attempt by the people the co-chairs who've been put in charge of the negotiations, they produced the zero draft from having listened to all of the parties. In early 2020, they produced a zero draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which at that time was more complicated. It had goals, it had milestones to achieve by 2030, it had targets, and it had indicators. So at that stage, relating to the biodiversity outcomes that we want to see, there were only 6 targets. And they were very closely aligned with the 5 big drivers of biodiversity loss that have been identified in the IPBES global assessment. So IPBES is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So the first one of those, to do with land and sea use change, that was sort of split into 2 different targets because it's so big. It's to do with stemming loss and then also restoration and protection. So that had 2 targets. But the other 4, overexploitation, pollution, invasive species, and climate change, had a target each. So that was published in the middle of January 2020. And then a group of people, on the academic side, the science side, involved, really interested in this process, thought, well, those are all really, really important. So although we're talking about target 4 here, it is critical to remember that all of these targets in the framework are important if we want to stem the loss of biodiversity and see a restoration to healthy levels. But what we wondered is, for a number of species, given the highly threatened status we know many species have because of global or national red lists, is that going to be enough for all of these species? So we undertook a piece of work, and that was that suggested to us at that point, more than 30% of species on the IUCN red list and those comprehensively assessed groups would need something extra. And that's because they've got small populations or small geographic ranges. They've got threats like emerging wildlife diseases that are not mentioned, or combinations of threats, or they've on the red list, which is not just a list of probability of extinction, it's a huge database of information on threatened species. There are some very species-specific actions that have been identified. So we published then a preprint, which means it hadn't been through peer review. So it was just our work and it's open to criticism. But we published a preprint because we wanted it to influence the negotiations. So we published that at the same time as we submitted it for a publication. So I'll just put in the chat here the link. They're both open access, the preprint and the final paper. So we went away and then really worked on this at the same time as that policy process was taking place. And the next iteration of the Global Biodiversity Framework, post-2020 as it was called then, did include something around urgent recovery actions for species. It was included then as target 3. So that was great from our point of view because we had the urgency that some species would need specific targeted action. That was in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So we were then tracking and monitoring the negotiations, and the first time that it appeared, target 3, all it had was by 2030, ensure active management actions to enable wild species of fauna and flora and recovery and conservation, and reduce human-wildlife conflict by X%, number to be determined. And you've seen, as Jennifer showed, it ended up being much, much bigger. So that's something that is a little bit of a concern for us because there's a lot of words in there that are not about action, they're about outcome. And this is the only target that mentions the word urgent. The whole framework obviously is urgent, but this is the only target that mentions urgent. So we were tracking the negotiations, and thankfully it stayed in. There was some attempts to kind of water down wording or to use slightly different wording, but the essence, those first few words of the target talk about urgent management action. And that was finally adopted in December 2022. And in July of that year, we had that final paper was published online. And then with reviews, comments from reviewers and changes to the methodology and updates to the red list, that number had actually gone up to 57% of species on the red list in those groups that we looked at needed urgent recovery action. So we're really thankful the report, the paper was mentioned in negotiations in the contact group at COP15. So it did show that having a little bit of a look to see what kind of information gaps there were in the policy negotiations, going away, doing the work and publishing that work, sharing it with policy officials as you go along, did all have an impact. So it's fantastic that that work is there. But it does highlight a lot of species. They all need those other targets, reducing all those threats, but they need some more.
Thank you, Phil. It's often both encouraging and a little confounding to have the curtain lifted and just see how detailed and how much work goes into negotiating this framework, and hopefully today we're helping to clarify some of that. But I find that background really, really useful. And it sounds so complicated. I'm glad we have folks like yourself and others really helping to inform those negotiations. So Phil, I want to hear a little bit more about what the task force is doing at the end of the kind of the second part of our panel this morning. So I'll come back to you in a moment. But I now want to move on to that first action under the Global Species Action Plan, which is to assess the conservation status of all species, which is to look at their extinction risk, population size, trends, distribution, threats, and the conservation potential of species. And then the second sub-action under that is to develop national red lists. And so just in way of a little bit of introduction there, here, the Global Species Action Plan, or GSAP, as we like to call it, is referring to using frameworks and methodologies that enable you to evaluate that extinction risk. And the global kind of standard for doing this has been developed by the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, on their red list of threatened species. And so to introduce that in just very brief terms, and you can look up the website and some more information on this that we'll have posted and shared for you. But essentially, the IUCN Red List uses a quantitative series of criteria, of which there are 5, that measure different aspects of extinction risk. And if a species meets one of those 5 criteria, it can then be assigned one of the IUCN Red List threatened categories. Now, there are 9 IUCN Red List categories, starting with not evaluated, going to data deficient, which means there's actually not enough information about the species to assign it one of the other categories, which are least concern, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild, and extinct. And it's that vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered block of categories that represent the threatened species. So when we talk about threatened species, at least in this context or in others related to the IUCN Red List, those are the 3 categories that we mention, and those are the 3 categories triggered by those criteria. And as actually Phil mentioned, which was a great kind of introduction to what the IUCN Red List tries to do, is not only list threatened species, but it also includes all of the information that that was used to then evaluate the species against those criteria. And those include those actions, the types of information mentioned in the GSAP subaction. So population size and trends, distribution, threats. There's also information on the species ecology and habitats. But something that we've also recently added to the IUCN Red List is the green status of species, which takes care of that last bit of subaction 4.1 in the GSAP, which is to also look at the conservation potential of species. And with that, I'd like to ask Barney Long if you can provide a little more information about this new component of the green status of species, and maybe differentiate it from other green lists that IUCN has as well, just in case there are any questions there. I think I saw some coming in the chat. And so you can, to help us understand this newer tool that IUCN has developed. Barney.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, so the green status of species was published and launched about 3 years ago now. So it's still relatively new, and more and more species are being assessed using these new criteria. It is officially part of the Red List, so it's not a separate mechanism, but it is providing additional metrics to assess the conservation status of a species, basically helping the Red List tell a fuller story of the conservation status of species. Whereas the Red List categories that you just talked about, Jennifer, look at how close a species is to extinction, the metrics under the green status component of the Red List look at how close to fully recovered a species is. And so for the first time really sets a global standard definition on what full recovery of a species is, and then looks at where a species is on the nexus towards that full recovery. There's multiple different components to the green status, but the two I'll focus on here, which get at that conservation potential, look at how conservation actions can drive the recovery of species in the future. And to do this, we look at scenarios. So one component of the green status is looking at the potential conservation gain a species can recover to in the coming 10 years with really good solid conservation action. This allows us to really say in 10 years time, where could a species be in terms of closeness to fully recovered with good conservation action. We also have another component which looks 100 years out, and this is more about helping say what a species could recover to biologically, understanding that the real world does not always permit biological potential to be reached, but where could you get to in 100 years with biological recovery of the species? So this really allows us to start looking at some other parts of that target 4, which is abundance of species and the relative status of a species and different components of the range to get around some of these species that might be really safe in a very small percentage of the range, but absent from a large proportion of the range. So really trying to look at full recovery of the species to allow the species to be fulfilling its ecological function across its indigenous range.
Thanks, Barney. You made the complementarity of the two tools very clear. And what I like so much about that is it fits so well the target 4 wording. We need to know what the threatened species are, but we also need to be working for their recovery. And so this assessment step that the GSAP recommends really helps us identify both the threatened species, but it sounds like also the conservation potential even. So as we move on to that second step of really identifying those species that need the urgent action, we have all that additional information to inform that process. So thank you for that explanation. Now, one of the actions also under GSAP here is to develop national red lists. And so I'm going to be the panelist just quickly for this answer, for this particular point, because I'm also sitting on the National Red List Working Group of the IUCN Red Lists. steering committee. So we are looking really at how we support the application of the IUCN Red List methodology at the national level. And this is really important, and now even more important because of this commitment governments have made to identify their threatened species and then recover them under Target 4. And then all the other actions, as Phil mentioned, throughout the Global Biodiversity Framework that will help make that possible. And so there are a lot of resources available on this, so I won't spend too much time on it. We will include links to webinars specifically that Reverse the Red has organized about national red lists. And so we'll provide those in the chat as well as in the video description. What I really want to highlight for you is not only the complementarity of the global list and the national list, but also the resources that are available to countries to develop their own national red lists or to use the IUCN methodology at the national level. So the first resource are a set of guidelines that that direct the use of this global methodology at the national level, also the regional level, so outside perhaps of country boundaries to more of a geographic or ecological area, but also within country boundaries. So you can do a red list for a ecological area within a country. But really the goal there is so that countries can identify their threatened species in a systematic way and really look at what the trends are as well, and have that repository of information that Phil mentioned, the threats, the habitat, the distribution, the conservation actions needed for each of their species. The complementarity comes in here where any species that is endemic to a country, once assessed for a national red list, should be the same on the global red list. And so one of the things that the working group and Reverse the Red and others are working on is finding ways for the two processes to collaborate so that the global red list and the national red lists are not only using the same methodology, but coming to similar results. And so we can really see how efforts at the national level to assess species can assess a subset of species that the global process doesn't need to. And the two can really work in tandem and avoid duplication there, but instead really look to collaboration and support, because at the end of the day, we need to be using this information to recover species. So there's a lot of information about that out there. Please look it up. But I will mention finally that a new document is coming out very soon from this National Red List Working Group to support the development of national red list projects. And so it really walks you through all of the elements that you might want to think about, how to decide which species to assess on your national red list, and tips and tricks and best practices as well. And so there are resources out there available for you. And later on in this webinar, Mike will talk about how Reverse the Red is supporting efforts that are ongoing to develop these national red lists, among other things. Let's move on now to kind of the second part of that GSAP action. And as a reminder for everyone, and even for myself, it is to, the first part was to assess the conservation status of all species. And then kind of my separate section that I've taken from that is that we need to then identify those threatened species needing targeted and recovery actions. And so now I'd actually like to turn back to you, Barney, to talk a little bit more about how it is that we not only identify those species, but first of all, what it means by species that need this targeted recovery action, and maybe give an example if you have one front of mind.
Yeah, thanks firstly to Phil for kind of filling this question in for me already. I think it's really important to note that when we look at generic threat reduction actions such as habitat protection, pollution control, anti-poaching, you are going to save vast numbers of species with those large generic actions. But there's a large proportion of species that are still going to need something additional if they are to survive and recover. And so the kind of actions that might be additional to those kind of big generic threat reduction actions could be where a species has got down to a very small population size and needs active management of the population, whether that's through conservation breeding or translocations or genetic recovery, etc. So that's one option, one example rather. Another example could be where a specific disease has come in to a population and very specific species actions are required to mitigate the impacts of those disease. And unfortunately, I would say more and more species are being impacted by these species-specific threats that not only are they threats to their survival, but without addressing these issues will not permit the species to recover. And that's ultimately the goal of Target 4 is recovery. And so reducing threats doesn't necessarily allow a species that breathing space to recover, and sometimes additional action is required for that recovery. And so when you do a red list assessment and a green status assessment, when you start looking at conservation action planning, those specific actions should become clear and you should be able to pull them out of these assessments. And as I think we'll get into later with the work that Caroline's doing, we'll start to understand what needs to be done at a country or regional level to help large numbers of species, and what are those species that are very specific that need those individual tailored recovery programs.
Thanks, Barney. In fact, that was the perfect segue to my question for Caroline, is there are many tools out there to support people in kind of conservation planning. And in fact, that's the topic of the next webinar. But I thought your work with the assess to plan process would provide a nice bridge between this assessment work, identifying those species in need of those actions, and then the next webinar and the next GSAP action, which is to then make plans to do that. So I wonder if you could tell us about your work there and how that might support this process.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And I think that your description of the assess to plan process as a bridge is a really good analogy. And what Barney and Phil have talked about already is a really good platform for talking about what we're trying to do with it, which is essentially to catch those species that are identified or categorized as threatened during the assessment process, and then to use the data that, as Phil explained, is a really significant information resource that's captured through red list assessing, and also to combine that with structured discussions with not just the assessors, but additional conservation practitioners and experts to work out for those species categorized as threatened, what is the most appropriate work stream to channel them down into for the next 5 to 10 years to make sure that they get the attention that they need and that they don't just remain as species listed as threatened until the next assessment process. And so we recognise that we have to move really efficiently, that we don't have the resources to do detailed planning for every single species. So we do need to be able to plan for multiple species concurrently in ways that are going to actually address their needs. So we want to keep the level of planning sufficiently detailed to be able to really understand and address each species' needs, but not so detailed that we can only plan for tiny numbers of taxa. And so what we do with the assess to plan process is we have 5 broad streams that we channel species into. One of those streams is around site and area planning, which is really for those species for which some targeted site or area-based planning is likely to be the best route to conservation and recovery over the next 5 to 10 years. and where we can see that a number of species group around similar sites or areas, so we can really focus planning attention at that level. We have a stream that is about habitats, so it's about those species that are inextricably connected to a habitat that is, or a microhabitat that is itself highly threatened. So we need to focus planning at that habitat or microhabitat level. So, you know, things like old trees, things like mangroves, alpine meadows, things that we're losing really rapidly. But that involves a different, you know, it's a different group of experts, it's a different group of practitioners. So that's another stream. We also have a stream for the kinds of threats that Phil talked about, things like disease, where we're not necessarily only going to be taking action at a site. We might need to be taking action at national borders. We might need to be setting up research projects. So there are sort of multidisciplinary responses to some of these threats. The same would go for things like illegal trade, where we can't necessarily protect species at the point at which they're being removed from the wild. We also need to tackle trade routes, and we need to tackle consumer communities. So those kinds of threats that have roots and shoots and other bits of foliage that all need to be ripped out. Those we have species that are subject to those, but the planning element might really need to be best tackled by putting specific threats front and center of the planning conversation in ways that are going to deal with a lot of species simultaneously. Invasive species is another one of those. But for a lot of species, as everyone else has already mentioned, those things might be really important for the long term, but in the short term, they're just not going to act quickly enough or comprehensively enough to address the challenges that are faced by those species that, as Phil described, are down to small numbers, they're highly fragmented, they're already genetically compromised, or species that are still quite widespread but are heading downhill very quickly and we don't really know why. So for those species, we do need to take a much deeper dive into really understanding what will help them and into understanding who might be able to provide that help. So an important aspect of Assess the Plan is not just looking at what's needed, but looking at who can provide for that and how we connect the species to those groups or to those projects. And so the stream that looks really at what we might consider to be the target 4 species has a bunch of associated tools that are related to action that we might need to take intensively in situ, you know, putting up artificial structures or artificial habitats, providing supplementary feeding, translocations, reintroductions, the things that Barney talked about, but also the ex situ components of that can provide support by accelerating growth in wild populations, providing for translocation, and also providing insurance that buys us that extra time to really understand what we can do in situ. So there are some additional tools provided through the Conservation Planning Specialist Group to help people plan ex situ projects in ways that will provide the best possible support to in situ efforts. And there are also other IUCN resources that help people to plan those translocation and reintroduction projects. And then we have one final stream, which is for species that really don't fit in well with other species. They don't group well, they have very different needs, they're high profile, and so those go into a stream that is about individual, very detailed species planning, which is our more traditional recovery approach.
Thank you, Caroline. And Megan has listed, put in the chat the link to a webinar that you have done earlier with Reverse the Red on this. And so folks can look at that and learn more in depth and hopefully get in touch with you if they have any more questions. Thank you for that. Barney, I wonder if you could speak briefly about this kind of next sub-action. As we look at our assessments, we've identified species that need targeted action, really setting up monitoring programs to look at this. Again, there are resources available for this. In fact, there's an entire specialist group at the IUCN dedicated to this. But I wonder if you could briefly orient our listeners to what this action is trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic, but very briefly, I'd say there was probably three different levels that you can look at for monitoring. One is at the very lowest level is project level. So whether it's a non-government or a government level project for the recovery of a species, how is that project doing? Is it meeting its targets? Is it achieving its outputs, etc.? And obviously, there's multiple resources out there on how you can monitor the impact and effectiveness of projects. Then you can look at the monitoring of a species. And I think Megan has put in a link in the chat to the species monitoring specialist group of the IUCN Species Survival Commission. That provides a really nice a list of resources for various different taxonomic groups, because there's no one way to monitor the population of a species. So you have to dig in deep to each individual species and how you would go about monitoring it and what's the most effective versus realistic way of doing things given constraints and opportunities at a specific site or country level. But then you have the higher level question of how do you monitor species as a group, whether that's at the global level for something like all amphibians or at the country level in terms of the state of biodiversity at the country level. And that again comes back to these assessments, and there are new ways to monitor this through something called the Red List Index. We're also developing a green status index to look at how you can track the recovery of species as well. And these require doing assessments regularly so that you can reassess species and come up with new indexes at regular intervals. And ideally, these would be done through comprehensive assessments, i.e. assessing the entirety of a species group. So all birds in a country or all sharks in a country. When you have enough comprehensively assessed groups, you can also look at an index which is for a group of comprehensively assessed species and therefore start to look at the biodiversity of a country. And so there's lots of different ways to monitor, and that could be a whole series of webinars in itself, but just kind of touching the surface there.
Thank you, Barney. Mike, over to you. We've heard about the framework, the goals, the target, the different actions that can be taken, the fact that there's so many tools and there's so much expertise available out there working on this problem or have already developed tools to help answer some of these questions and solve these problems. I wonder if you could talk about what role Reverse the Red is playing in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer. So like you're saying, there are a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of availability for different frameworks and different types of thinking. And that's really where Reverse the Red sits, is we want to try to accelerate and amplify recovery-focused strategic actions. For us, that means how do we understand and kind of connect with all these different tools and resources that are available and make sure that all of you have access to those. But in addition to just access, it's what we know, and Barney was just kind of speaking to this, every scenario is a little different. And so when you're facing a challenge, whether you're looking at a national level assessment or a species assessment, sometimes you just need a little help in working through that and figuring out which tool might be the best, which framework might be the best. So we want to exist to be able to support you in that through understanding your needs, what challenges you're facing, and we can try to partner you with the right people that have that expertise to assist. That's a lot of what Reverse the Red is doing. And then ultimately, this has been mentioned, and Jennifer, you mentioned this too, our kind of big goal is that there's a global strategy, every country has its own national strategy, and then at the species level and the local level, there's a lot of strategies. Right now, those are often not aligned or working in complement with one another. So we're working to try to align those strategies. So for example, as everyone here has been mentioning, ultimately, a lot of the kind of national and global assessment comes down to something like abundance, distribution, population threats. if you are working at a species level or a localized level, making sure that you are assessing information based on those types of indicators so that when national biodiversity strategies are created and developed, that there's an opportunity for your assessments and your information to cross pollinate, to link. Right now, I would always kind of, one of my strongest encouragements is if you're working on species efforts, have you read your national biodiversity strategy? Do you know your country or the country that you're working in's national biodiversity strategy, your national biodiversity plan? If you haven't read it yet, go find it online. These are all due to be updated here towards the end of this year. So there's an opportunity there that as we work to support national governments developing those biodiversity strategies, that all of our kind of species or localized efforts can work in alignment. I think that's one of the biggest opportunities that's available to us, is just to be aware of what our countries are tracking and what they're trying to achieve on biodiversity recovery, and making sure that our efforts are aligned. And then the last thing I'll say on that is with IUCN Species Survival Commission, they have a number of centers for species survival that are geographic focused. So they're focused on specific areas or specific countries, as well as a series of national species specialist groups, which is a group of volunteer taxonomic experts helping to inform and support national decisions around biodiversity. Those teams of people are absolutely fantastic. They're kind of the perfect set of people at the interface of helping develop national planning, as well as having the expertise of how do we implement action for different species in some of these different initiatives. So if you're involved in any of those or want to become involved into those, reach out to me. We'd be happy to help connect and help you kind of advocate and support national level assessments, national level planning, all that type of work. So that's really the space that we sit in, is that connecting. And then how do we understand who's out there doing really good work? There are a number of countries that are doing fantastic national level assessments. Barney was mentioning about a number of them that are building out their indices. As we learn about those best practices, then we want to take and hear those stories and understand them and share them so that we can all learn together and we can implement these types of strategies in our own context.
Thank you, Mike, for explaining that connecting and activating role that Reverse the Red is starting to play. I'd like to move on to questions, but first, and Megan, I'll need your help with the Q&A. But first, I just want to make a note that that Reverse the Red has started looking at species pledges, and many of you made those during the World Species Congress, and that is still open as a way to start tracking species that are having these recovery actions implemented for them. And I know, Phil, you and the Global Biodiversity Framework Task Force of the SSC are also working on an indicator to try and figure out as well how many species are actually have these interventions or these actions in place as well. Is that correct? And that's something that's forthcoming, right?
Yes. Well, it's not. Hopefully, it is forthcoming. I don't know how quickly. The first part, in terms of identifying the species that need that action, we've done that work, so that is there. The second part, which is really challenging, is then gathering. There's so much action underway for species and for those species. So some by zoos, some by NGOs, some by governments. How do you capture all of that information? So that's the part that we're really getting our thinking caps on for. There's two, with the CBD itself, there are 2 time points to see if we could have new indicators added to the framework. One is the COP16, which is coming up in October of this year. And then 2 years later is COP17. And COP17 is the last chance to have any indicator included that will then be used towards reflecting progress by 2030. So if anybody's got any really amazing ideas on how to capture all the diverse activity that's underway by zoos, NGOs, universities, governments and others, and businesses, then we'd be delighted to hear.
Thanks, Phil. Sounds like a great conversation for the Reverse the Red teams and the your GBF task force as well to continue having. I know we're already in discussion, but it sounds like a problem that will require lots of brains, won't it? And anyone who's also listening. So thank you for that. So looking at the questions, we have one asking whether it's possible for an individual to develop a national red list. And that really speaks to kind of the nature of national red lists. And so ideally, this is outlined as well in the guidelines, ideally national red lists are an official list of threatened species recognized by your government. And so it will take quite a bit more work than one person can initiate, and it will require that recognition as well. Now, different countries have this set up in different ways, but a lot of them are moving towards this model where governments recognize these national lists. So whether the government actually sponsors or actually requests that this list be developed by their research institutions, or whether it's something developed by the research institutions and then the government adopts the list of species. It's just every country is a little bit different, but it generally is not an effort that an individual can take. And this national red list model is actually developed from decades now of countries having red data books, which often look at a particular set of species, but not comprehensively and not necessarily with the purpose of monitoring their status over time, which is something that Barney mentioned, which is really looking at that index of change over time. And so these national red list guidelines that are coming out soon will help you kind of understand how to set those up and really what the purpose of those national red lists are. But that doesn't mean that one person who wants their country to have a national red list can't start that conversation in their country and get that process started. So the question was anonymous, so I can't follow up directly with you, but do start that conversation in your country, find out who your research institutions are and whether your government has a process already, or if there's something that you can get involved in or get started there. So we have great. We have a question. Phil is typing an answer to one of them. And so I just lost a longer one here. Oh, Mike is answering the question from Saha. Thank you. And Phil, you're answering the question from Sarah. I did get a couple of questions during one of the World Species, the Congress, that I thought were interesting. And somebody was asking about whether the difference between national and global assessments, but the trade-off between conservation action targeted at nationally threatened species versus globally threatened species. I wonder, Barney, if you could speak to that, whether there is a trade-off at actions at that national level versus, which represents maybe just a tiny part of the range where they may be less threatened, or whether countries should be focusing on species where larger areas of their distribution are actually within their country.
I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer to that, because countries are obviously responsible for the biodiversity conservation within their country. And if they deem it important to work on a specific species, even though they only hold 1% of the global population, that's completely up to them. I mean, when you look at it from a global resourcing point of view, obviously larger focus should be on species which have a larger proportion of their range within a country, but that doesn't mean to say that one small section of a range is not important. So I think those kind of discussions and decisions need to be made locally.
Thank you. And there are guidelines and best practices on that question specifically, both in the IUCN Red List regional and national guidelines and the forthcoming National Red List project guidelines. Thanks, Barney. Okay, well, with that, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. I'd like to wrap up by thanking my panelists today. Your time that you invested in the webinar today will continue to reap benefits because this has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube. So thank you for kicking off this Reverse the Red webinar series on Global Species Action Plan actions for Target 4 with us. I hope this has been useful for our listeners as well, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.